So my name is Javier Safdar. I run the Partnership for Safe Medicines. We are an organization, a coalition of 70 different healthcare groups that touch your medicine from the factory floor to the pharmacist that dispenses it. And 70 people in the supply chain, let me assure you, agree on nothing. Nothing about how the healthcare system works or what things cost or anything else. What they agree on is that counterfeits are real and very dangerous. We are in the fourth wave of counterfeits in this country that we've seen in 2 decades. And today I want to talk to you and bring to you 2 experts in organized crime, because organized crime has a long history of counterfeits. Our speakers, Javier Pena and Steve Murphy, spent 6 years in Colombia, working and living with the Colombian National Police while stationed with the DEA. They led the world's largest criminal manhunt to bring the world's first narco-terrorist, Pablo Escobar, to justice. And I learned this because they gave me an advanced copy of their book that's coming out in November last night. But there were times when they had about 10 minutes to leave their apartment because the cartel had figured out where they live. None of us live with that kind of danger. A much more pleasant assignment, though, after that was when they got to be production consultants for the TV show Netflix Narcos. And if you're a fan of the show, you may have some questions. For example, Steve had a cat. On the TV show, the cartel killed the cat, but that's not really what happened. That's Hollywood license. The cat died of old age in Colombia. Also, and let's take a look at what they look like. On the left is Pedro Pascal, and on the far right is Javier Pena today. You can see that Javier Pena is much more attractive than his on-screen actor. Personally, let me just say this. Very few of us are ever called to serve in the way that Javier and Steve had. Very few of us are asked to put our life on the line for a DEA paycheck, which I will assure you is very, very generous. And so I believe we all owe them a thanks as American heroes. Would you please welcome to the stage with your gratitude, Javier Pena and Steve Murphy.
Thank you. Wow, thank you very much. Well, we got a standing ovation. I guess our work's done here.
Let's go home. Thank you.
Thank you for giving us a few hours of your time this afternoon.
Remember, lunch is next, Steve. So
oh, that's right. Sorry.
We're not going to go away over your lunch here.
Okay, give us 3 minutes and we're done. I know everybody's hungry, right? You know, we are honored to be here with you this afternoon, and thank you for that recognition. And by God, thank you for your service to our country, too, because you're our state legislators. So if anybody deserves a round of applause, not those people there, you do.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for what you do for us. Now, we'd like to tell you, we're up here to tell you the story about Pablo Escobar and the Netflix series Narcos, but that's not why we're here today. We can do that offline this evening if we bump into you down the lobby. But we're here to discuss a newer drug trend that's responsible for killing thousands and thousands of Americans. And it's not new. It's been around, as you saw, Javier just showed you, for almost 20 years now, and that's counterfeit medications. When we talk about counterfeit medications, we're talking about fake pills, outdated medications, falsely labeled packages to create the appearance that it is legitimate and it's good to go. We're talking about legitimate medications that the bad guys are taking, and they're either reducing the active ingredient in there, making it inert, or they're removing the active ingredient completely and then replacing that with maybe an antibiotic or maybe fentanyl. We'll talk a little bit more on that in a few minutes. And then they take the active ingredient and sell that on the black market as well. So this is all about making money for the bad guys. Now, we'll be the first to tell you, we're not the experts on pharmaceuticals and the deviation of those, but we do have a little bit of experience with organized crime. And that's what we're talking about here, ladies and gentlemen. We're talking about transnational organized crime or transnational criminal organizations, whether you want to call it TOC or TCO. We're talking about the traditional drug trafficking organizations. But we're also talking about organized crime that doesn't traditionally come across as a drug trafficking group. And we'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go along this afternoon. I just lost my place up here. Now, some of you probably know as much or more about this problem than we do, but some of you probably don't. So you may be wondering, well, does this really affect me? Does it really affect you and the constituents and your areas of responsibility? Or is this just limited to the drug addicts who have chosen to take these counterfeit medications or illegal narcotics to destroy their lives? How does this pertain to the hardworking, law-abiding, tax-paying citizens in your area? Well, ladies and gentlemen, let us introduce you to Bailey Hinkey from North Dakota. JP.
Imagine you're a parent in your home and the police come into your home at 3 a.m. and tell you your son, your daughter has died of an overdose. I'm sure some of y'all know people that this has happened to. We know people that this has happened to. This is what happened again with Mr. Hankey. Bought fentanyl off of the dark web, had just one dose, died. But again, this led to the dismantlement of a huge organization that was selling fentanyl on the dark web. Another case, the Daniel Vivas Cerron case. Daniel Vivas was a Colombian living in Canada. He had already been arrested. He was I think he was distributing cocaine there in Canada and also doing counterfeit pills. Anyway, from inside his prison cell, he was able to distribute fentanyl via the dark web and just all over to the US, Canada, again, by using a cell phone in his cell, had a big, large distribution network. So he did about 5 years, and then he finally got deported and went back to, they sent him back to Colombia. Anyway, en route back to Colombia, the plane stopped off in Panama, and by that time, the U.S. put charges on Mr. Cerrone. So we were there to arrest him, and we quickly brought him back to the United States. But again, funny story, his mother was waiting for him in Bogota. So then when our agents told the mother, hey, your son has just been rearrested and is being charged in the United States, she said, this can't happen. He's been in prison all his time. Again, using the cell phone in prison in Canada and the dark web. How do you head an organization this major? He's responsible for the deaths of 4 people in the United States. His sentencing will be later on this month in the U.S.
Okay, so let's get the next slides up here. So here's a map of the United States. Take a look on there and see where your state is located. This represents states where counterfeit medications containing fentanyl have been located. There's 48 states shown up there. No, actually, are we on the right? Yeah, 48 states. Mm-hmm. The only ones that aren't is Hawaii and Delaware. Now, I grew up in Tennessee and West Virginia. I went to high school and college in West Virginia. I call that home. And I'm very familiar with the drug problems we have in West Virginia. And if the legislators here from West Virginia, I'd love to meet you later on. I'm shocked that West Virginia hasn't had any reported deaths from fentanyl-laced counterfeit medications up there, but I hope it's true. But if your state is listed in red, that means your state has had deaths in the state because of these counterfeit medications containing fentanyl. And then we take a look at the next slide. You can see since 2012, 63 different types of counterfeits have been discovered in your various states. And you can see the chart right there where your state falls in there. That should be very scary for all of us. Now, this problem has a very personal side to it.
And this is, like Steve said, this is very personal for us. And again, it's personal for y'all because you know people who have died. And we've had, like I said, the honor of meeting some of those people who died, their family members. It is just devastating. The first person, if you see Maggie up there on the screen, she had just started a job at a restaurant. She was all excited and picking up a box, she hurt her back. And she did not want to take any time off, so a friend of hers said, try this, it's oxycodone, it'll help your back. She tried it, went home that night, she died that night. That pill was received from a friend who got it from a doctor in Florida. The doctor, a legitimate licensed doctor, was making his own pills laced with fentanyl, bringing in, he had his own pill press, bringing in the fentanyl from China and selling it to the patients. Unbelievable. That doctor has been arrested and is serving life prison right now, and he deserves it again. The other person, you see the far right, Tosh Ackerman, and again, this is another tragic story. We know his mother, we've talked to her, and we acknowledge her, and she's on the speaking circuit, talking to school kids, college kids. Javier, she's also on your team, and like I said, we love that. Now, the kid, Tosh, never did drugs, hated drugs all his life. He had been sick, and he had a big, like a rash type problem, could not sleep. He was already under doctor's orders, could not sleep at nighttime. He just wanted one night just to get some restful sleep. So he purchased from an acquaintance a pill, Xanax. The acquaintance said, try this Xanax, it's gonna help you pill. And being so cautious, all he did was just took a little piece of the pill of the Xanax. And you know those Xanax is kind of oval shaped, just a little piece. That little piece was laced with fentanyl. Again, died. They discovered him in the morning. His mom has been devastated, but she's doing the right thing. The person who sold him the pill is in prison. But fentanyl, all you need is, they describe to us, if you look at the penny, Lincoln's beard. If you can just put a couple of granules on that beard, that's all that will take to kill you.
And then you see Miss Betty Hunter in the middle photograph there. Ladies and gentlemen, think about it. Some of you have probably suffered from cancer in your lives, or your family members have, or friends. We all have acquaintances, right? My mother-in-law is 91 years old, has terminal cancer right now. She's in a nursing home. And I hesitate because I'm one of the guys that actually likes his mother-in-law. But she's taking medications. Well, Betty was taking medications as well, but the medications she was given were counterfeit. So the active ingredient had been removed from the Avastin. Now what this does, think about it. This is what we call the perfect crime, because we all know that Betty had cancer. And when she dies, we all think, well, you know what, cancer just won. But the truth is, some criminal organization has sold someone a counterfeit medication which prevented her from getting the medication that she needed that might have prolonged her life. Maybe she would only live for another 3 to 6 months, but that's 3 to 6 more months that the family would love to have with her, right? So we call this the perfect crime. It's just horrible what goes on here. So how do we get to this position to start with? This fentanyl, what are we talking about? Fentanyl is just basically a synthetic painkiller. It's actually a legitimate medication. My mother-in-law has a fentanyl patch because of the pain that she suffers from the cancer as it's consuming her body. But we got the bad guys who have learned how to make fentanyl. And they've realized how much profit there is in the production and distribution of fentanyl. So roughly a kilogram, 2.2 pounds of fentanyl will cost them about $5,000 to make. Now keep in mind, there's no quality control when they produce this. They put the ingredients in a cement mixer, give it a few turns. Some of the pills that come out after it goes through the pill press are going to be placebos. They're going to contain no fentanyl. But those on the other end of that spectrum might contain several grains of fentanyl, which is an overdose level. So their $5,000 investment, and then they have to buy the pill press, the dyes, and the molds, say another $1,000 to $2,000. So let's say there's a $7,000 investment. If they create pills that contain just 1 milligram of fentanyl, we're talking about a financial return of up to $20 million on a $7,000 investment. That's more than legislators make, isn't it? That's a joke. That's a joke. If you increase the dosage units in those pills to 2 milligrams, well, if your body is not used to taking opioids, that could be a potential overdose death right there. You've probably read the articles. It takes as little as 4 grains of fentanyl. When I say grains, I'm talking about the equivalent of a grain of salt. So we all know salt. We put salt on our food. 4 grains of salt or fentanyl will cause an overdose death. That's how powerful this drug is. This is how heinous this whole crime is. And I got to throw some stats at you because we're former government employees, and that's what we do. But this will put this in perspective. It does for me. In 2017, the CDC reported 70,237 overdose deaths in the United States. 40,600 of those came from opioids, from pain medications. But this puts it in more perspective for me than anything, and you'll never forget the stat I'm getting ready to tell you. Of those deaths, that equates to 192 Americans dying every day, 365 days a year in 2017. 192 Americans dying from this. Oh my gosh. Now we've gotten the stats in, preliminary stats on 2018. They're roughly saying now that CDC is reporting at 68,557 overdose deaths in 18, but so that shows a reduction. But these are preliminary estimates. If there's a reduction, I'll be shocked. But even if there is, we're still talking the equivalent of 187 deaths per day. It's just unbelievable. Interpol reports that there's an estimated 1 million people die every year in the world from counterfeit medications, and that's what we're trying to get across to you today.
Let's talk a little bit about these organizations, Latin American organizations that have, these organizations are already in place. If we look at the Colombian trafficking organizations, we look at the Mexican trafficking organizations, they're polygroup. In other words, they've been doing cocaine, they've been sending heroin, now they're getting into the counterfeit medication business because they're already set up. They got the distribution routes, they got the distribution people here in the United States. They like I said, in matter of fact, 2 blocks from here, we got IH-35, which is one of the busiest corridors, and I know we got some interdiction representatives here, right? But you know, it's very well used. It comes from Laredo. As you all know, Nuevo Laredo's right across the border. The trafficking, I used to be, I was here in Austin, DA, then I had the whole region. I had Houston, so I had the southwest border, and IH-35 was just very busy with trafficking. And you know, it's hard to get to the, how they like you said, it's the cargo containers, tractor trailers that are coming across. But anyway, the message is this cocaine, heroin organizations are shifting. They're doing counterfeit pills. Matter of fact, Mexico just did a study where they're saying that 60% of the medications that are being sold in Mexico are false. Can you imagine 60% falsified? I remember, and I grew up on the border, I grew up in Laredo, and back then people used to go to Nuevo Laredo to buy all their prescription pills, all their pharmaceutical cancer pills, and I'm just, you know, thinking now of, you know, what we know now is how many of the pills, like Steve was saying, are false. It was all placebo. The person died of cancer, oh, the cancer took her. Yeah, but if you would have had the righteous medication, that person could have lived a little bit longer. So we're seeing Colombia, again, doing the counterfeit medications. We're seeing Bolivia. We're seeing Paraguay. So the message is they're shifting. They're doing these drugs because it's a lot easier to conceal, and it's a lot cheaper for them to manufacture these counterfeit drugs, and they're making a lot of money here selling it in the United States.
So, make no mistake about it. These people are targeting the United States. You know that. You know that as well as we do. Why are they targeting us? Because everybody wants to be us in the world, right? We're the best country in the world. But we also have the dubious distinction of being the largest illegal narcotics consumer nation in the world. That's why they target us. I got to throw some more stats at you. According to the CDC, recreational use of oxycodone and hydrocodone has now surpassed the illegal use of cocaine and heroin here in the United States. Okay, that's our counterfeit meds. Also, according to the CDC, more Americans die now in most major cities, more Americans die from overdose deaths than they do from car crashes. And this last statistic, this is so eye-opening. I read a report that says 1 in 6 teenagers have experimented with some type of pharmaceutical either to change their mood or to get high. And you know what the average age of those teenagers is? 12 to 13 years old. Ladies and gentlemen, I have 4 children. I hope that my kids aren't included in that, although my youngest son is. I have 5 grandchildren, and I don't want them to be part of that statistics. And I don't tell this. You may wonder why are we up here talking to you? Do we have a vested interest in this? And this is off script. I didn't even have this planned to say, and I would ask that you keep this in the room here. But of my 4 children, my oldest son is an orthopedic surgeon in Atlanta. My younger son, who's 37 years old, is an opioid addict in West Virginia. Just got out of prison because he's a thief. That's my vested interest in being here with you today. Sorry.
This Mexican drug trafficking organizations that are dealing with the pharmaceuticals, they don't care. You know what? If people die of an overdoses, you think they care? Of course not. They're in it to make money, and money's the main principle that they're behind. We've had some of the, and if you look at the violence that these cartels employ, and I know we're getting close to lunchtime, but you've all seen the photos of bodies, on the bridges. We've seen the heads rolling on discotheques. These guys are just vicious. They're going to do whatever they can. Their main thing is the intimidation. Corruption, intimidation, and the violence. That way people will not get in their way. And if they do get in the way, we got horrific stories, which I don't want to mention. But like I said, their main purpose is to send their counterfeit medication, drugs, anything they can to make money to the United States. We've had some of the biggest drug trafficking organizations in the Tijuana area, which is, San Diego. We've had the Samami drug trafficking organization that was supplying all sorts of, like you said, counterfeit medications into the United States. So again, their main purpose is, make no mistake, is to make money off of their drugs.
And it's not just the Mexicans and the Colombians. We got our brothers, the Chinese, there taking advantage of our country, don't we? You see up on the screen, we're talking about the Zhang drug trafficking organization. This organization was producing fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. They had shipped to 25 foreign countries that we're aware of, as well as 37 of our U.S. states. And the guy in charge of the organization, Zhang, bragged that he had actually shipped to all 50 of our states. And they're using various websites and multiple company names to do this. He would offer to produce any counterfeit medication you wanted, and then he bragged about the fact that he would help you hide that from customs and law enforcement here in the United States. He even offered that if your drugs were seized as they were being shipped to you, that he would replace them for free. Boy, there's free enterprise marketing, isn't it? Going to take care of your customers. It's unbelievable what these people were doing. But then, you know what? His drugs resulted in 2 overdose deaths in Akron, Ohio. That resulted in the indictment of Zhang and his organization. There were 32 indictments as a result of that investigation. And this was the first time, this is in 2018, this is the first time that Chinese nationals were indicted in a drug-related case in counterfeit medications here in the United States. The question is, will we get him extradited from China? I'm not holding my breath on that one.
There's no extradition, right?
Right. And then the traditional Hells Angels, the motorcycle gang, I remember growing up, these are the bad guys. We knew they were involved in extremely violent acts in gun running and methamphetamine. Well, they hired some marketing professionals to try to clean up, we're just a recreational motorcycle club. We all know that's not true. What we're showing you on the screen right now is a case that came out of Canada and Quebec. But does Hells Angels have chapters here in the United States? We all know they still do, right? And they're not just involved in the Xanax that you're seeing on the screen. They're still moving cocaine, marijuana, guns, methamphetamine. And not only were they dealing in Xanax, but they were also dealing in OxyContin and Dilaudid.
Some of the smuggling methods, have you seen here? And just remember, it's creativity. That's all it is. We've seen during our days working Pablo Escobar, Medellin cartel, man, we saw some of the most ingenious methods. It could be as small as putting cocaine in a Coke can. And what do we say? Things go better with Coke, right? We saw a lot of that. We saw the smuggling of cocaine inside grapefruits. How they did it was just ingenious. They would take all the pulp out, and then hermetically they would seal it again with cocaine. We saw the concrete, inside concrete, wooden pallets. Lately, we just saw one inside a toupee going into Spain. He had about half a key of cocaine. So he looked a little bit like Lyle Lovett, but it was just, please don't tell us Lyle Lovett. But it was like, wow. Then we're seeing the submersible vessels coming out of Colombia. There was a great clip Coast Guard just did not too long ago where they were seizing a submersible vessel. I think it had, 4 tons inside?
It's unbelievable.
Something like that. I just saw also from Mexico, jalapeno cans putting in cocaine in jalapeno cans. So I know y'all are having a fajita lunch today, right? So if your jalapeno is white in color, you may rethink about eating that. Should be green.
Pass on that one. Yep. So we're looking at, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
We're looking at seizures of fentanyl coming into the United States. In January of this year, we saw the largest seizure of fentanyl so far to date. We're showing 650 pounds of fentanyl and methamphetamine. It was actually 395 pounds of meth and 254 pounds of fentanyl. And when you see this in the press, they like to report how many people could die from that. And you know what? The government likes to report that as well because it gets people's attention. And we're talking about the potential for millions and millions of deaths here, overtaking our country. Prior to that, just to give you a little perspective, the largest fentanyl seizure in the United States was August in 17. DEA seized 145 pounds in Queens, New York. So does that sound like the fentanyl issue is going away? Absolutely not. It's just exacerbating itself, getting larger and larger. According to the CDC, another stat for you, fentanyl is now the most frequently used drug in overdose deaths in the United States, coming from our friends, the Chinese, the Mexicans, and coming from India as well. If you remember the singer Prince, his death, I mean, that made the media for weeks and weeks, didn't it? Died from an accidental overdose of a medication that contained fentanyl. It touches out and reaches everyone. Now we say that the organized crime, they try to create the appearance of legitimacy, and that's what they're doing. These people already have established smuggling routes, right? So when we're talking about if they're trying to smuggle methamphetamine or cocaine or heroin, we're talking about bigger packages. Well, fentanyl, we told you a kilo, 2.2 pounds, how small that could be compared to, say, 500 kilos of coke. You're getting as much money, if not more, from that. They can mail it in the mail. They're using, like the Chinese, they'll have their chemical companies, which are legitimate chemical companies, but then they're producing generic medications, but then they're doing the illegal stuff on the side. So they're mixing it in with the legitimate business to try to create the appearance of legitimacy.
Now, again, going back to some of the organizations we worked in Colombia, these organizations were huge. If we look at Pablo Escobar, the Medellin cartel, the biggest organization, Escobar was responsible for 80% of the cocaine. What happened after that got taken down? We had other organizations take their place, but now the modern organizations, and let me just say right now, Colombia's a great country. There's 99.9% of their people are great, innocent, hardworking people. It's that little 0.5% that ruin it. We have a lot of friends in Colombia, but again, they have learned. They're more independent, they're low profile, but they're still doing like I said, the distribution of drugs. And like I said, the police are doing a great job in Colombia, but they're independent. We're getting a lot of Venezuelan also organizations where they're just, again, they'll, whatever they can do to send their dope across. They're altering the batch numbers. They're also big into counterfeit medication. There's been a lot of large seizures in Colombia. Like I said, sending the counterfeit medications to the United States. So it's still a problem. We're still working with them. And like I said, Colombia is one of our closest allies, and we have a lot of respect for Colombia. They're trying, they're doing a good job, but these traffickers, they do not care.
Some of the other criminal organizations, and you were probably expecting us to blame everything on the Mexicans, the Sinaloa cartel, which everybody knows, and the Colombians. But there's criminal organizations all around the world, as Javier told you earlier. The Russian mafia, they're one of the worst out there now. But we also got the Italian, the traditional organized crime out of Italy involved in this as well. And you know, the most famous is the La Cosa Nostra. You know, they're actually the biggest threat from Italian organized crime to the United States. Then after them, you've got the Sicilian mafia. But you've got another organization called the Camorra. We weren't familiar with that. In fact, we learned a lot about this from Javier here. And what we found out about the Camorra is that initially they made their money from reconstruction, you know, fixing the books and strong-arming unions and so forth over in Italy. But then they got involved in cigarette smuggling, and they still control that through Italy today. So if you want to smuggle cigarettes through Italy, you got to pay them like a war tax. You know what? That's what Pablo Escobar did when he was in prison down there. He wasn't smuggling drugs, but he was still charging a war tax on the other Colombian drug traffickers. So I guess they learned from history. At least they studied their history, right? But the Camorra, what they did is they realized that there's so much profit to be made from counterfeit medications. They got involved in that as well. Again, polycriminal organizations, not just straight out drug-related organizations. They realize that as we get older, we need medications. You can see we're not spring chickens up here. We got to have our meds every day, just like everybody else, to keep kicking. They also realize that this is guaranteed income because of the reliance of people around the world on our medications, right? And it's also a form of social control, believe it or not, for them over in Italy. So what they're doing is they're known to go copy the barcodes off of legitimate shipments of narcotics, and then they'll save those for later, and when they produce their counterfeits, they'll add these previously legitimate barcodes and try to pass those on through. You know, there was a pharmaceutical rep in Italy who was interviewed, and he says that on average, we're talking about cancer medications, that on average, 5 tractor trailers of their medications are stolen every month. Wow. I mean, think about that. 5 tractor trailers worth of cancer meds that can now be exploited, that the active ingredients can be removed and exploited and put in our fentanyl or whatever you want to put in there as well, right? What they'll do also is they will, when they get those medications, they take the active ingredients out, then they put the inactive ingredient, or they reduce the active ingredient, and then they put the barcodes on there, and they're pretty good at passing those off as legitimate medications. We've got another Chinese individual, Mr. Kevin Zhu, who was also offering to route counterfeit medications through other countries before they got to the United States to try to hide the connection to China, because our law enforcement's good at taking a look at that. Well, he got so cocky about this, he went to Bangkok and met a couple of guys and sold them $167,000 worth of counterfeit meds. Turned out they were 2 undercover ICE agents. Then he got so cocky, they said, hey, why don't you come to Houston and have dinner with us? We want to take you to our favorite noodle restaurant. So he brings his wife on that one. Of course, you know what happens. He got arrested. The funny thing is, we just learned this morning that when they went to tell his wife what had happened, her first remark was, so we're not going to the noodle restaurant? Priorities, right? After his arrest, Kevin admitted to distributing counterfeit medications to 29 different, he admitted to distributing 29 different counterfeit medications in the United States. This is kind of sad for me, though. His sentence, he only got 78 months. For all the death and destruction he brought to our country, that's all he got. And we just kind of have a problem with that. Again, as we said before, just so you don't forget this, China, followed by Mexico and India, are the leading countries in introducing counterfeit medications into our country.
The Chris Torkelson organization, again, and before I talk about this organization, just a funny tidbit, I always tell people that everybody gets a kick. You know, when Escobar used to run his cocaine labs in the jungles of Colombia, at every lab, he had a sign, if I catch you using the product, I will kill you. So he didn't want his guys to be using coke, wants everybody else to be using it. The Chris Torkelson organization out of Canada, and this is it's kind of sad. This guy had his own legitimate Canadian, it's called Canada Drugs, distributing a lot of counterfeit medication to Canada, to the United States, but just companies. His company had a lot of employees, and when he got indicted, and they would falsify the customs forms, but a lot of it was coming to distribution businesses in the United States, all fake medication. Anyway, again, his sentencing, wow, like Steven said, it was just, 5 years probation. For how many people died, how many people did not get better because of this false medication. His company, they were able to prove, and he had to forfeit $34 million. How do you, and you get probation for the forfeiting of $34 million? Wow, unbelievable. Again, then, you know, we talk about extradition. And, you know, a lot of people think this is an easy to extradite some of these traffickers from other countries to the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, this is one of the hardest procedures we go through. I did 9 years in a foreign arena. You know, in the basic extradition, first you have to have a treaty. China, we don't have a treaty. We have treaties with Colombia, but the treaty says they can only be sentenced to 30 years. We have to obey that. And it'll take anywhere from 2 to 5 years. It's paperwork that you would not believe. It's DOJ dealing with the fiscal's office in that foreign country. Like I said, it's real hard. It's not easy. We've seen the Chapo Guzman case, the extradition. That's different. If it's a high profile, they will still try to help help us out. And even the Chapo case, the extradition took about, what, 2 to 3 years to get him up here. So it's not easy when people will say, well, let's extradite. And a lot of these countries have their own problems. So when we go to them, hey, we need help, says Javier, Steve, man, we got our own problems. I know that, medication is important for y'all, but we're dealing here with heroin, coke traffickers. So it is hard for them to help us. They do in the long run, but again, it's not an easy process.
And so we're back to Bailey. U.S. law enforcement did a phenomenal job in creating this international drug case, but is Bailey ever going to get justice? Are we going to be able to get those Chinese people over here? As Javier said, extradition is extremely difficult. We do not have an extradition treaty with with China, I'm sorry. During the Kevin Chu case, they did find the companies that were involved, the chemical companies, and the Chinese did make them close. But nobody went to jail over there, and they're not going to go to jail because whether it's payoffs, I don't know what's the different priorities. Your guess is as good as mine. So how can we combat this a little bit? Well, one of the tools that we use is the Treasury's, U.S. Department of Treasury has the Office of Foreign Asset Control, in which they can designate certain groups as, under the Kingpin Act, they can designate them as significant foreign narcotics traffickers. What that does is that prohibits U.S. companies from doing business with them whatsoever. It gives Treasury the opportunity to go after them, after their assets. And if any company does do business with them, they can go after those assets as well. Now you think, well, we've got Canada. Is it easy to extradite from Canada? They're one of the members of the Five Eyes community. And if you're not familiar with that term, there's 5 countries, United States, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. Those are our 5 closest allies. And so we work together very closely on intelligence projects as well as law enforcement projects. But that doesn't mean the Canadians are going to extradite their citizens to us. It's a long, extremely difficult process. You have to go through the Office of International Affairs and the Department of Justice, the mountains of paperwork that are necessary. I mean, he was telling you about the one guy that only got 5 years probation. That was through a plea agreement because the Canadians didn't want to extradite him. Or maybe our prosecutors didn't want to take a chance that they would get him extradited and then lose the case. There's a variety of different things that go on in this to make it very difficult. These type of cases are extremely manpower intensive. Most law enforcement officers don't have the experience. They're coming along, but they don't have the experience to deal with recognizing fentanyl. I know that we have a legislator here from Missouri who's a former police officer, Justin. And back when he was a task force officer with DEA in St. Louis, when we'd seize drugs, we'd pull out our little test kits. We'd take a little bit of the drug out and put it in the kit. You do that with fentanyl, you may overdose. That's how lethal this is. It's an airborne ingredient there that can kill you right on the spot. So there's a lot that goes on. The corruption is always an issue. No guarantee that we're ever going to get these people here to the United States. How do we fix this problem? Well, here's some people right here in this room that can help. But as we tell people, we just did an interview this morning, we cannot expect our legislators to get us out of the drug problem of counterfeit medications. You're an important part, and you lead in the enactment of the laws that we need to produce this. But we can't look at our law enforcement and say, hey, it's your responsibility. We cannot look at one single part of our community, of our society, to take us out of the drug problems here in the United States, as well as the world, right? So we're big proponents of education at the earliest possible age. If that's elementary school children, you got to scare the crap out of them, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with my 5 granddaughters hearing at the earliest possible age about how dangerous drugs are. We need to bring the communities together, bring our legislators, our law enforcement, our doctors, our pharmacies, our faith-based communities, our house mothers, our housewives, everybody. We need to bring the whole community together to attack this problem. We're going to turn it over to Javier now, but we thank you very much for giving us a few minutes to listen to us this morning.
Thank you, guys.
All right, keep it going for the Narcos. Thank you. So the partnership has been studying counterfeit medicine since 2003 when we started, and we pull together constituencies and stakeholders from all parts of the country, including law enforcement. And there is a very unique perspective that law enforcement has as being on the front lines of both the opioid crisis, which is actually three crises, which is a crisis of prescription medications in the wrong hands, a crisis of illegal drugs like fentanyl and heroin, but it's also a crisis of counterfeit medications, which affects everyone from addicts to non-addicts equally. And so I want to just play for you a little bit from Sheriff Keith Kane from Kentucky, who wants to give his perspective on counterfeit medications and importation. Can we roll that?
I've been a sheriff for more than 20 years. Among sheriff's many duties, we protect our communities from illegally imported fentanyl and counterfeit pills that often come from other countries. As chair of the Drug Enforcement Committee for the National Sheriff's Association, I am convinced that opening our borders to foreign drug importation will only increase the threat of counterfeits and escalate this crisis. These unintended consequences put lives I'm sworn to protect at risk. We encourage Washington to say no to prescription drug importation.
So our law enforcement is trying to tell us something, right? It's about the opioid crisis. It's about those 48 states, about the 33 states with overdoses from those counterfeit pills. It's about the states with first responder fentanyl exposures in the line of duty when they're doing an assay by the side of the road. And when we talk about importation, you know, we look at things like, okay, well, we'll import drugs from someplace else, but track and trace will protect us. Well, there's no track and trace in Canada. That's not going to work. And experts say it can't be fixed. We have to talk about the cost of medications and testing and safety, which is a long-standing federal law. It's very complex to test a pill. And the law requires that you test statistically relevant samples of batches of pills. The math on that is very expensive. You can't get 99.9% purity without spending millions of dollars. So that's why the FDA secures medication from the factory floor onwards. It doesn't just buy it off the black market and then say, well, we'll test some pills, because it's too expensive to do that. And it's been tried before. If you're familiar with the history, which is a total nerd thing, it's been tried in 3 different states. Every single one of them so far has had patient safety issues. And remember Betty Hunter, the Narcos talked about her? From 2008 to 2012, we had a wave, that's the 3rd wave of counterfeits in this country, of counterfeit injectables, oncology, osteoporosis medication. And that is a small sample of the hundreds of cancer doctors around this country that got warning letters from the FDA that they did business with one of the 5 wholesale rings that was trafficking in these fake medications. To this day, we still don't know how many people were affected by that. And the reward, this guy, one of those 5 ringleaders, he was indicted in 2014, and his decision was to sit in Canada. He knew they couldn't extradite him if he waited long enough, and he made $78 million from that scheme, and that buys a lot of really good lawyers to fight extradition. And that was why in 2018 he got a plea agreement, because it was clear that they were never going to get him out without risking losing it. But the other thing we know about importing drugs from Canada is that Canada is smaller than us. We also know that they have price controls and socialized health care. The Canadian population is not happy about these ideas. It's great on our side of the border, but on the Canadian side, the patient groups have said no way, because they figure that we're going to take all their medication. And so from the Prime Minister on down, Canadians have been warning us that we can pass all the laws we want, but they are not going to let us implement this. So the thing to remember is that the difference, and I think the Narcos showed this, and the history of drug supply chain safety shows this, is that the difference between us and other countries is that we have a more secure, closed regulatory supply chain. And every person who touches that pill is under threat of going to jail. And that is actually one of the greatest parts of a free market. When you do bad things, you actually risk jail time. And if we change that, we are going to be asking for the kind of problems that we've seen elsewhere in the world. We need to make ourselves as safe as possible, we need to continue supporting Customs and Border Patrol. We can't inspect our way out of this problem, but they are certainly doing an amazing job. And we need to tighten down on inspections and continue to invest in track and trace. And we will continue to have the best, most exemplary, and safest drug supply in the world. Now, we've run out all of our time, but we will be here afterwards for questions, and we would love to meet you and take a selfie with the Narcos. Not me. Thank you very much, everybody. Go have lunch.